Welcome, everyone. We are talking about the 1960s, and I am going to finish up talking about the civil rights movement here. The last time we were discussing this, I had mentioned three organizations of the civil rights movement, and there they are: the SCLC, the SNCC, and the Congress of Racial Equity, or CORE. So all three of these were trying to move forward this civil rights movement. And as a result of that, they came across some resistance in the South. We looked at this photograph the last time we were together. We talked a little bit about that. That's in a Birmingham bus terminal. And we've already mentioned all of this. So this is a form of resistance, of course, from white Southerners, but there were some other forms of resistance. For example, in Georgia, the state incorporated the Confederate battle flag into its state flag. So this was the new flag as of 1956. This is no longer the Georgia state flag. It's been replaced, but that date, 1956, should be an important one since it is during the civil rights movement. And this is just a form of white Southern resistance to that movement. And here Georgia has incorporated the Confederate battle flag into the state flag. So they're making a statement with this. Alabama and South Carolina began to fly the Confederate battle flag over their state capitol buildings. And in Little Rock, a form of resistance was to keep the Central High School, the main high school there in Little Rock, from integrating black students into the school. And so 9 black students were ordered to integrate in 1957, but the governor, a guy named Orville Faubus, said no, they will not be integrated into the school, and he sent the state's National Guard to prevent that integration. President Eisenhower in turn found out about that, and in turn sent federal troops to escort those 9 black children into the high school. And you can see some federal troops there over to the left. And you can also see the hatred of the local whites there in Little Rock toward this one particular student. The woman with her mouth open right behind the black student was a student herself. And interestingly, not long after this photograph was taken, she befriended the student, and they became, I don't know that I would call them good friends, but they exchanged letters years later. And so that's kind of what happened after this photograph was taken. But again, this is an example of Southern white resistance. And what this resistance did, photographs like this in particular, helped the movement, the civil rights movement, to win sympathizers and supporters in the United States and really around the world. Once photographs like this got out, it angered and embarrassed President Kennedy, who we haven't said much about. I'll say something about him in just a minute. But it embarrassed him, especially when the leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, criticized the U.S. for its racism and segregation. So this was an embarrassment to the United States. We're a nation who had tried to take the moral high ground against the Soviet Union, and here Nikita Khrushchev is taking the moral high ground against us. Now, 1963 was a very important year for this movement. That spring, organized demonstrations took place in southern towns and cities. Thousands of protesters were arrested. For example, in Birmingham, TV crews captured images that really disturbed the world. And this is one of the reasons for these organized demonstrations. They knew that these types of photographs would be taken. Also, newsreels were taken and shown on the nightly news. And this is important because lots and lots of Americans by 1963 owned televisions. Interestingly, in 1948, less than 200,000 Americans owned TVs, and just a few years later, by 1952, well over 15 million homes had television sets. So Um, Americans all over the country were seeing these kinds of things every evening on their television during the spring of 1963. Now, one of the reasons that Birmingham was used for these demonstrations, there's another photograph. One of the reasons Birmingham was used for these demonstrations was this man right here, Theophilus Eugene Connor, also known as Bull Connor. He was the commissioner of public safety there in Birmingham, Alabama. In other words, he oversaw the police department and the fire department. Now, there was an injunction or an order in Birmingham that no demonstrations were to be done. And Bull Connor said that he was just enforcing those injunctions, but he brutally enforced those injunctions. Once again, you can see in these photographs how demonstrators were treated. And Bull Connor and Birmingham became symbols as a result of this reaction, became symbols of Southern racism. And after the demonstrations in Birmingham, President John Kennedy began to back the movement. Now, he hadn't backed it before, but before I get to that, let me read this quote. So here's President Kennedy after the Birmingham demonstrations. He said, and again, he's seen photographs. He's been briefed on what's happened. He's seen newsreels. He said, "We preach freedom around the world, but are we to say to the world, and much more importantly to each other, that this is a land of the free except for the Negroes?" And so this is Kennedy starting to change his public opinion about the movement. In private, he had backed the movement, but publicly he had to be careful. And I'll explain why he had to be careful in just a few minutes. Well, back to Birmingham, local businessmen in that city feared that the city was becoming a symbol of brutality, and it was. So they helped later in 63 and 64 to desegregate those downtown businesses. I don't know if I've told you this, but most Southern downtown districts were segregated. For example, department stores that had lunch counters, blacks could go in and buy merchandise, but they could not sit and order from the lunch counters. Only whites could do that. But in Birmingham, as a result of these demonstrations, those local businessmen changed that and desegregated the downtown businesses. Also, as a result of the Birmingham demonstrations, Martin Luther King, who was there, was arrested, and he was jailed for about 9 days. And while he was in jail, he wrote a very significant, really a classic statement of the civil rights movement known as the Letter from Birmingham Jail. So he's in a jail in Birmingham. He's arrested during those demonstrations, as were many other civil rights activists. And he wrote a letter while he was in jail called Letter from Birmingham Jail. As a class, we'll talk about this the next time we get together. Actually, I think we will have already talked about this by the time you hear this. So we've just put it in context. And so now you should know a little bit more about that letter. All right. So again, 1963, a big year. We've got the Birmingham demonstrations. We've also got, in August of that year, the March on Washington. The March on Washington. During this march, 250,000 whites and blacks converged on the nation's capital. And this is considered the high point of the nonviolent part of the civil rights movement. So there will be another part of the civil rights movement that we'll mention briefly a little bit later on. But this March on Washington was considered the high part or the high point of this nonviolent part of the movement. This was the largest public demonstration in the nation's history up to that time. Again, 250,000 people there in Washington. Now, on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, which is where this photograph was taken, Martin Luther King delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. And what was happening here, and the reason this march was called, was for the civil rights movement to pressure Congress into passing a civil rights bill. This bill was hoped to put an end to segregation in the South, and it was hoped to put an end to disfranchisement. Again, the two goals of this movement are to do away with segregation and disfranchisement. So here's this march in 1963. Lots and lots of people have gathered, and they're pressuring Congress. They're doing this to pressure Congress into passing some kind of civil rights bill that would end segregation and disfranchisement. After these events of 1963, Kennedy stood before Congress and he asked them to present him with a civil rights bill. Congress writes these bills, and then the president can help push them through Congress, and then at the end, he's got to either sign it or veto it. He said that he would sign it, and he was planning to address the nation about discrimination when he took a trip to Dallas, Texas. So let me say a few things about this young president, John F. Kennedy. He was the youngest president ever elected to office, elected at the age of 43. He was also the first Catholic president. There was a lot of talk when he was running for office about him being Catholic and whether or not he could be loyal to the United States, or would he be loyal to the Vatican. And he assured Americans that his loyalty was to the United States. And so he was elected president in 1960, began serving in 1961. And his administration is mostly remembered for its offering of hope in the future. If you remember, he's the president who stood up in 1961 and wanted to put a man on the moon before the decade was out, before 1970. And sure enough, that happened in July of 1969. He was a president who was also very sick, and it was hard to tell that by looking at photographs like this. He looks like a young, healthy man, or a fairly young man who was healthy, but he had Addison's disease, for which he took a lot of drugs. He had at least one doctor to travel with him, and he gave him drugs daily in order to battle Addison's disease. He was a man who was often in pain as a result of this disease. He also had several sexual liaisons while president, and despite this, his reputation has remained positive. The media didn't mention his illness. The media didn't mention these sexual liaisons, and so most Americans had no idea about them, but they saw him as a young, vibrant man. And interestingly, he was president for less than 3 years. And because he did not see that civil rights bill pass Congress that we talked about, he and his wife visited Dallas in November of 1963, and it was there that he was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald. This is one of those moments that defines a generation, and that generation still, many of them can say where they were when they found out that the president was assassinated. Now, so I mentioned a little bit earlier that Kennedy had personally backed civil rights, but not publicly. And the reason he did not publicly back it is because he was a Democrat, and the Democratic Party was a very odd beast at this time. Part of the party consisted of northern white liberals, and Kennedy was one of those. He was from Massachusetts. And these northern white liberals were on the side of the civil rights activists. They wanted change. But the party, the Democratic Party, also consisted of Southern whites. And these were the people who had originally put Southern blacks, had segregated them and disfranchised them from voting. So this is a very odd party. And when it came to civil rights, Kennedy had to be very careful how he acted, because he didn't want to push his Southern base away from him. And that's what he would do, he knew, if he backed civil rights. But finally, in 1963, He decided to back civil rights. This really caused problems within the Democratic Party. But again, Kennedy didn't get to um, uh, uh, see the Civil Rights Bill pass. That would pass on to his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, who became president after Kennedy was assassinated. Here's President Johnson, who's, by the way, from Texas. Johnson was a tall man, and he was the kind of guy who would get in your face if he was trying to get you to do something, and he would kind of push you against a wall and get in your personal space. It was called the Johnson treatment, and here he is giving it to somebody. I forget who the gentleman is he's talking to, but he doesn't appear to be backing down as many people did. They would back up when Johnson would get closer and closer to them. So he was a senator from our state of Texas. He was a heavy smoker, and he's the president who saw the Civil Rights Act of 1964 pass. So I'm going to tell you, actually, I'm going to show you 3 slides giving you details about 3 very important civil rights acts. So here's the first one, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This is the one Kennedy called for and did not live to see pass Congress, but Johnson did, and Johnson said he would sign it, which was very strange because he was a white Southerner and a Democrat, and most white Southern Democrats did not want him to sign this, but he did in 1964. What the Civil Rights Act did was outlaw racial and sex discrimination in public accommodations like restaurants, hotels, theaters, and it also outlawed racial and sex discrimination in employment. All right, and again, this was very unpopular with whites, particularly Southern whites. All right. And then the second piece of legislation, very important, passed and signed the very next year, is the Voting Rights Act of 1965. By the way, let me just back up a little here. The Civil Rights Act took care of segregation because it's outlawing discrimination, and the Voting Rights Act took care of disfranchisement. So what the Voting Rights Act did was it authorized the federal government to protect the right to vote and permitted federal enforcement of minority voting rights in individual counties, mostly in the South. So this was to ensure that all, particularly minorities, were allowed to vote. All right, and this ended disfranchisement in the South. So what the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act did was basically designed to enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments that were passed during Reconstruction. I've already put those up. You should know those by now. And of course, both of these were opposed by white Southern Democrats, and this really changed the party of the Democratic Party. In fact, when Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act in 1964, he mentioned to one of his aides who was standing there, he said, "I think we just delivered the South to the Republican Party." And he did. So, interestingly, today, most white Southerners tend to vote Republican, and most governments in the South, state governments, are Republican. So what happened when Johnson signed that legislation in 1964 and then the Voting Rights Act in 1965, white Southerners began to leave the Democratic Party and to migrate to the Republican Party. All right, so the civil rights movement has been successful. It had eradicated the legal basis of second-class citizenship by passing the Civil Rights Act, and then also it had allowed Black Southerners to once again vote by doing away with disfranchisement. One more little piece of, or not little, one more big piece of legislation I want to mention to you from 1965 and part of the civil rights movement was the Immigration Act of 1965. What this was a brand new approach to immigration and who was allowed to immigrate into the United States. So the last bit of legislation we had talked about as far as immigration happened in 1961. I'm sorry, 1921 and 1924. You remember those quota-based acts. Well, the Immigration Act of 1965 abandoned that quota system, and it established a racially neutral criteria. So the quota system was based on race. It basically said only a small number of people from certain countries could come into the United States. So it set up quotas. This Immigration Act was more about family reunification. So if you had family members who lived here and you wanted to immigrate to the United States, it would be easier for you to do that. Also, if you possess certain skills that were in demand in the United States, then you could more easily immigrate. So as of 1965, immigration to the United States is not based on a quota system. All right, so a lot of new significant legislation passed in 1964 and 1965. And even though legal racial segregation and racial disfranchisement ended, this did little to alleviate the economic inequalities that existed between white America and Black America. So there are a lot of economic inequalities, and Black Americans were wanting better opportunities or more opportunities for better jobs, and they were wanting equal pay. And so this was the next phase of the civil rights movement. It had more to do with economics than politics. But the movement would change after 1965. Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968, so other leaders rose to the top, Malcolm X being one of them. And King's approach and his philosophy, his nonviolent philosophy, was abandoned by many and replaced with different philosophies. For example, the Black Power movement was part of this second part of the civil rights movement. All right, we won't be talking about that. We just simply won't have time. But what we're going to talk about next is the Vietnam War. And so we'll continue with the 1960s in the next lecture.